What is up, people? Today we'll be looking at every Castlevania game on the original Game Boy, but I will be sneaking in an additional Game Boy Color game also developed by Konami that I do believe counts as a Castlevania game in disguise. While the series had banger after banger on consoles, the Castlevania series on Game Boy was pretty hit or miss in my opinion, and had a pretty rough start, which was Castlevania the Adventure. This game came out in the very first year of the Game Boy lifespan, being released in 1989, and just compare this game's graphics to the other games released the same year. Super Mario Land, Quirk, Alleyway, Fist of the North Star. These simplistic looking games have nothing on the immaculate graphics of Castlevania the Adventure, which looks like something you'd see on NES around this time. But these impressive graphics didn't come without a cost. First thing you'll notice about this game is that it plays really slow. Now, Castlevania's intent has always been to be a more slower and methodical game by restricting the player's movements and forcing them to think ahead before performing an action, since they really have to commit to everything they do. But I kid you not, booting up one of the NES games after playing Castlevania the Adventure makes it feel like Sonic the Hedgehog. And look, the speed of this game is unfortunate, but certainly not enough to ruin the game if it has solid design, which this game certainly doesn't. For one, this game doesn't even have sub-weapons, though you'd think it was designed with them in mind. These bats just feel completely out of place given Christopher Belmont's limited capabilities, which you can upgrade twice, increasing your power and range. And the final upgrade actually allows you to shoot a fireball, which is a pretty cool idea. Problem is, unlike the other Castlevania games, if you get hit once in this game, you lose your whip upgrade for some stupid reason. I mean, this is not a thing on the NES Castlevanias. Who thought this was a good idea? I already don't like this decision, but I guess it can't be too bad with thoughtful enemy placements, right? Well, unfortunately, you're at the mercy of RNG for much of this game. Take this spot for instance, you're stuck on a rope, which yes, stairs have been replaced with ropes in this game, which I actually prefer, since I'm not a fan of being trapped on the stairs in the NES games. But anyway, you're on this rope, and this enemy shoots a ball with ricochets off the walls and ceiling, and it can actually ricochet down to where you are on the rope while you're completely defenseless and unable to do anything, which means you have to continuously go up and down this rope until the enemy shoots a projectile you can actually avoid. So this is what I mean. Why is RNG such a big factor for avoiding enemies like bats and these guys, when all it takes is one hit in this game for you to lose your whip upgrades? I'm pretty sure there are parts in this game you actually can't get through if you have the standard whip, since you simply can't kill enemies fast enough to get through. In this section, your character is so slow that you can't avoid these guys' attacks, unless you have more range with whip upgrades. With the small whip, the only thing you can do to avoid them is walk backwards. But if you do this, it respawns the guy behind you that you already defeated, meaning you just get sandwiched between the two. I mean, this type of enemy feels like it would be designed with Richter's backflip in mind, but this is Christopher Belmont, the most sluggish dude in all of Castlevania. So yeah, it's required that you have the whip upgrade. The only way you can get through this part with no upgrades is to damage boost past the enemies. But if it's impossible to defeat a Castlevania game with no whip upgrades without taking damage, plain and simply it's just a carelessly designed game. I don't know if anyone's actually done no damage, no upgrades successfully in the NES games, but they've at least done the individual levels. In Castlevania the Adventure, it's straight up impossible. Also, because there's no sub-weapons in this game, the candles which would usually drop hearts are completely useless in this game 90% of the time. They just give you points, but 10% of the time they'll give you either healing or a whip upgrade. A lot of these candles only exist to tempt you, but hitting them will only get you killed. Castlevania the Adventure's final level is potentially the hardest level in the entire series. My first playthrough I was stuck for so many hours, until I found out on the interwebs there's actually an invisible walkway that you can use to get an invisible rope where you climb up into a room that gives you a 1-up, an upgrade, and healing. Who the hell thought this cryptic nonsense was acceptable in a Castlevania game? Like in Castlevania you get wall meets, but these aren't cryptic. They've always been a part of the Castlevania design. Just like a block in Mario you wouldn't know gives you a power-up unless you interact with it. This here is so far-fetched and ridiculous. And this made the difference for me for this level being impossible to actually beatable, due to just how essential these whip upgrades are. The final boss in this game, I must admit, I do actually like, but he'll probably feel impossible for you your first time through, but he's a pretty fair fight once you know what to do, which mostly consists of just knowing where you can't get hit. This game was somewhat redeemed by the Game Boy Color version in Konami GB Collection Volume 1, where the speed has been increased to the point where it shaves off 2 minutes and 23 seconds off the original game's speedrun world record. It also makes this nonsense a bit more forgivable, with the obvious color change. This version is no doubt a lot better in my eyes, and I enjoyed it a bit more, but I still don't like the game overall. But most notably, this game would see a huge glow up with the WiiWare remake, Castlevania the Adventure Rebirth. Now this is what it's all about, a real video game. There needs to be more remakes of bad games instead of remakes of good ones, which is like what 70% of game releases are nowadays. Yeah, Castlevania the Adventure Rebirth is an awesome game that isn't actually much of a remake, since it doesn't really share many similarities with the original game beyond stuff like shooting a fireball out of your whip and eyeball enemies. It's more of a reimagining. but one that I can confidently recommend. It's really good. Interestingly enough, the same developer M2 recently came out with another remake of one of the worst Castlevania games with Haunted Castle Revisited, so honestly, M2 knows what they're doing when it comes to remaking bad games that actually need it over the pointless crap everyone else is doing. 2 years later, Konami would release a sequel, Castlevania 2 Belmont's Revenge. That's right, the other Castlevania 2, and the superior one. And it's called Belmont's Revenge because this release takes revenge on the first game for being so terrible. The developers of this game were clearly much more used to the Game Boy hardware, since it had been out for a while, and I mean the same team worked on Operation C just before this, which itself is one of the best Game Boy games period. Belmont's Revenge doesn't play nearly as sluggishly, you can even drop down ropes really fast. Even more importantly, this game is actually thoughtfully designed and even includes sub-weapons. Hooray! This game just makes you feel like the first was developed by amateurs at Konami. Maybe because the Game Boy wasn't a massive success by that point? I'm just guessing, but I think the sequel here proves you need a team of pros to make a Castlevania game of adequate quality. I should mention this game is also included in Konami GB Collection Volume 4 on Game Boy Color, which is the version I'm going to be mostly using for footage here, but unlike the first game, the one in this collection isn't actually any different as far as I can tell, besides the addition of color. Or not, since you can still play this cartridge on the original Game Boy too. But the European and Japanese version of this release has the cross sub-weapon instead of the axe that is present in the North American version. Konami GB Collection only came out in those regions, so this version has the cross. This game is actually developed with the Game Boy in mind, you know, a handheld device. Since something I forgot to mention about the first game is that there's no saving. They wanted people to clear the entire game in one sitting. A game that sluggish has no pick up and play quality, and I mean if you got 15 minutes to spare or something, it doesn't really matter since you can't make progress since there's no saving. Belmont's Revenge on the other hand, actually remember that it's a Game Boy game, so there is a password system and you can choose any of the first 4 levels, kinda like Mega Man, which I think definitely complements a Game Boy game. I mean Super Mario Land 2 went a similar route with its overworld for the same reason. This game is actually quite forgiving when it comes to checkpoints. Unlike basically every other classic Vania, you don't have to restart the whole level upon game overing. It merely puts you a little ways back. I think it's for this reason that I've seen people saying they prefer this game over titles like Castlevania 1, since having to restart an entire level can be a bit of a deal breaker for some, and that's on top of no saving. Despite this, I honestly wouldn't say that this game is easier than Castlevania 1, but it is more forgiving. Unlike most classic Vanias, there is no shortcut in Belmont's Revenge. Castlevania 1 you have Holy Water, Castlevania 3 you can use Sypha if you want, Castlevania 4 you have Whip. Bloodlines has an easy mode unless you start with as many as 5 lives. And Rana of Blood has Maria. Belmont's Revenge, you got nothing but your trusty whip and sub-weapons that are helpful but not at all OP. Easily the most challenging parts of this game are the boss fights. Christopher Belmont is still slow and has a hard time being able to move out of the way. You can't use your reaction when fighting these bosses. You have to know ahead what they're gonna do. Just like the final boss of the first game, it's more all about knowing where on the screen you can't get hit, which, yeah, I definitely don't prefer this sort of design over the typical boss fights you see in a Castlevania game. Once you know where you can avoid getting hit though, the bosses are fairly easy, so long as you don't screw up too badly. The final boss is for sure the hardest though, which you may be able to tell just from looking at it, and they didn't even bother giving him a second form since they knew that'd be overkill. The levels in this game are definitely designed more vertically than the other games. Personally, I do get a bit tired of climbing on ropes all the time. I'd rather be fighting enemies. Because there's not a whole lot of variety in these levels, I don't really distinctly remember them like I do in other classic Vanias. When I think back to this game, I just see ropes and boss fights. So while it's not a favorite of mine in the series, it definitely lived up to being a legitimate Castlevania title for the Game Boy, and in the end it certainly redeemed the extremely disappointing prequel. One thing I should mention is that out of the 5 games in this video, this game has easily my favorite soundtrack. Next up is Kid Dracula. Kid Dracula came from a time when Konami was so passionate about their own works, their developers would make their own parody games of them, instead of pachinko machines that they do now. Kid Dracula on Game Boy came out over 2 years after the Famicom release, so you'd hope that they would make some improvements over that version, and honestly, yeah, I would say that this version is slightly better. They've made changes to the level design and bosses, or made entirely original additions that weren't present in the original at all. In the Famicom game, the first boss is a single KKK member, whereas in the Game Boy version they have you battle a child, parent, and grandpa KKK member, just to give you an idea of these changes. The mandatory minigames in between levels in the NES version are also completely optional in this version, which is definitely a good change as it helps its replayability. Also, the level design in the original release felt like it was too much of just walking forward, and not much else besides killing an enemy that pops into view. The levels in this version are a bit more interesting overall, and don't have as much of what feels like wasted space. I've seen this game compared to Mega Man a lot for some reason, and I'm not really sure why. Maybe it's because Kid Dracula gains a new ability upon completing every level, but in terms of gameplay, this really isn't much like Mega Man. Kid Dracula Dracula, as you might guess, plays a bit like Alucard in Castlevania 3, albeit much more powerful since he can actually change direction in the air, but he has a lot more abilities, and he can even shoot above or below him. This game is definitely still on the slower side though, even slower than the Famicom counterpart since it's a Game Boy game, which is why it's a good thing that there's less wasted space in the level design. The Famicom version still might be more funny though, but this Game Boy version is just better designed in my opinion, and pretty easily my second favorite game in this video after Belmont's Revenge. There are a lot of late era QT Famicom exclusive platformers that the NES missed out on, and the Game Boy didn't really get games like this either. The library is actually pretty cursed, and there's mostly bad platformers unfortunately. But we did at least get this QT platformer. It might come as a surprise to you that it's more challenging than these games tend to be though, but this Game Boy version is definitely the easier of the two. For me, this is also pretty easily the best looking game in this video. The sprites here are delicious. A whopping 8 years after Castlevania the Adventure, Konami would drop Castlevania Legends, which to this day remains the only completely original non-remake Classicvania to release after Symphony of the Night, which, if you know anything about this game, is a real shame. Legends was developed by KCE Nagoya, a team synonymous with Kusoge. Unfortunately, they were responsible for 2 late-era original Game Boy releases in 2 very beloved Konami franchises, Goemon and Castlevania. The Goemon game came out 6 years after the first Goemon release on the Game Boy, and the game not only somehow looks worse, it's also just drastically worse in every way. Legends, as you might notice, not only looks worse than Belmont's Revenge, but also looks worse than the first adventure, which came out in '89, the first year of the Game Boy's lifespan. But unlike KCE Nagoya's Goemon game, Legends at least still counts as an actual video game. I like the game more than Castlevania the Adventure at least, because instead of being dreadful, it's just mediocre. Although Adventure's Game Boy Color version might still get the slight edge over Legends for me. Belmont's Revenge though is leagues above Legends, and once again proves you need a team of professionals to handle creating a real Castlevania game. The level design of this game is so dang boring, I mean just take a look at this. And feel free to ignore the Twitch chat spam in the top corner, I apologize for that. Very interesting stuff, fellas. Enemy placements are done so carelessly in general. The enemy variety is non-existent. There's bats on just about every screen, which are so cheap and respawn constantly. And this game has plenty of bullshit as well, although it's still an easier game than the first 2 adventure titles. I should mention this game shares the same director with Castlevania Dracula X on Super Nintendo, which is a game I've grown to actually really like. Although most were very disappointed about, and admittedly the first time I played that game I hated it. And Dracula X shares the same issue of having not so thoughtful enemy placements and cheap deaths. Like Richter though, Sonya Belmont can switch direction in the air, and can even move while crouching like Simon in Super Castlevania 4. The main similarities this game shares with the other adventure games are the ropes and whip upgrades that allow you to shoot fireballs. Every Castlevania game needs a stellar soundtrack, and even the bad Castlevania games like Haunted Castle still feature great tunes. One thing that is extremely disappointing about this game is the music. Outside of Stage 1's Bloody Tears, yes, they used Bloody Tears in the first stage of this game instead of saving it at the end like every other Castlevania game, the music in all the other stages is pretty lacking, although the boss tunes are pretty good. Also, one thing I forgot about this game is that it has these trap rooms which occur if you hit a wrong colored candle. Yeah, this is just stupid, and only serves to waste your time. Easily the most interesting thing about this game though is the story of Sonya Belmont, who's not only the first member of the Belmont clan, but also the sole female Belmont. Pretty cool, right? Well, unfortunately this game was such a disappointment that Igarashi quickly removed the game from the series timeline, so it's no longer canon. Anyway, I think Sonya Belmont deserves a second chance, and like I was saying earlier, it's games like these that deserve a remake the most, so hopefully M2 gets the unlikely opportunity one day to salvage this poor game. So that was all the Castlevanias on the original Game Boy, and 4 is a lot. I believe this ties it with the Famicom as a system with the most original Castlevania games, not counting things like emulation and collections of course, which is pretty interesting since I don't think Castlevania really gets associated with the original Game Boy. GBA sure, but not the OG. But it goes to show you how long the lifetime of this thing ended up being, which makes it all the more strange that Konami would go on to release 0 new Castlevania games on the Game Boy Color, especially no Metroidvanias. But is this really the case? Now it's time to reveal the game I was talking about at the beginning of this video. And that is Hunter x Hunter Kindan no Hihou, or Forbidden Treasures, and this game is essentially just a Castlevania Metroidvania with a Hunter x Hunter skin, released mere weeks after Circle of the Moon. As you can see here, Gon's Yo-Yo is essentially the vampire killer, and the enemies are very similar to those you would find in Castlevania, and the menus of this game probably look pretty familiar to you. And no, I'm not just bringing this game up because I'm a fan of the anime. I'm more of a Yu Yu Hakusho guy, but I'm not sure this would even appeal to fans of the anime since this game kinda does its own thing, with strange game exclusive characters like this guy who's a reference to Yu-Gi-Oh or something. He only appears in the Konami Hunter x Hunter games, I guess because they own Yu-Gi-Oh, but basically I don't have any biases toward this series, and I found this game to be pretty equally enjoyable to titles like Harmony of Dissonance and Circle of the Moon, which may sound crazy to massive fans of Metroidvanias, which is fair because to be honest I'm not super into those games. I definitely prefer the classic Vania style, but I still found myself enjoying this game since it's basically the lost Castlevania on Game Boy Color that never came to be. I was though bamboozled into thinking this game was developed by Konami, which is what is listed on most websites, but it seems to have actually been ITL. This game having no maps, or at least I couldn't find any maps, could be a deal breaker for some, but I mean Metroid 2 on Game Boy didn't feature a map either. I guess the language barrier is probably the biggest challenge for most, and I'm surprised this game has never received a fan translation, despite very questionable Game Boy games receiving English patches. But I mean, I didn't really find it to be much of an issue, and if you get stuck because of the language barrier, you can always use YouTube for help. Anyway, I genuinely think this is one of the best RPGs for Game Boy Color. It doesn't drag on and there's 4 playable characters with their own unique abilities to keep things interesting, but it's certainly got some faults with inconsistent difficulty. Some areas it's just way harder to get to a save point. I would have obviously preferred if this game was just a straight action game without all the RPG stuff, but this game should definitely be brought up when discussing the Game Boy Castlevanias. Give it a try if you're curious. So that concludes my video of Castlevania on the Game Boy, one of my favorite video game series no doubt, and the Game Boy games don't really get brought up very often, which may be deserved, but I do think Belmont's Revenge and Kid Dracula at the very least are not to be overlooked. If you like this video and want to see more like it in the future where I go over all sorts of Game Boy games, subscribe for more.